We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Hello and welcome to The Interruption, the Global Institute for Tomorrow podcast. The Global Institute for Tomorrow, or GIFT, is a Pan-Asian think tank that specializes in thought leadership across Asia. Today, we have Chandran Nair, GIFT's CEO and founder, to introduce The Interruption and discuss the concept of sustainability as more than a business buzzword. So, Chandran, this is the inaugural episode of The Interruption. What inspired you to create it?
Well, I've been thinking about this for a while, particularly prompted by the numerous people I meet who say that, who've urged me to communicate to a much broader audience, particularly in this part of the world, the younger audience, about some of the things that I've been talking about, much of which, if one might say, is not part of the mainstream narrative. And I feel very strongly that the mainstream narrative is essentially something that ought to be challenged, and particularly to get younger people in this part of the world to think more expansively about the region they live in, the challenges they face, and not be seduced by what they hear on Bloomberg TV or CNN, or what they buy in the airport bookshops about how the world looks like, which typically can be distilled to something about digitization, something about artificial intelligence, and everyone being an entrepreneur, but to expand the conversation.
Yeah, sure. All right. So can you give us an example then of what you consider mainstream narrative and how you push it away from that thought?
Well, for instance, if you look at this part of the world again, I have the opportunity and privilege sometimes to be invited to forums like the World Economic Forum, other forums, etc. And I am struck by how the approach to what these forums are about, which is facing the challenges of the region, are not conversations that we have originated from this region. They usually come from business schools in the West. They come from the think tanks in the West. They come from the agendas of multinational companies. And a specific one is this sort of dissemination of this idea, which very few people really actually probably understand, but it's become another slogan. And I think it's something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's become a buzzword. And so challenging that mainstream discussion is not to argue against progress or technological advancement, but to actually say, well, what levels of technology or industrial engagement do we have in this region? So I've written a piece recently for the World Economic Forum, and one that I hope is going to be published in the next few weeks, about deconstructing this idea. And my argument is very simply, whilst elites and can talk about this, they need to be extremely conscious of the influence it has on essentially the next generation, who then get on to this idea that somehow progress is defined through the adoption of ideas about technology and its influence in the region, through the lens of mythical places like Silicon Valley. And I argue, for instance, that most parts of this region, and particularly to get young people to think more deeply about this, that most parts of this region are so far removed from the idea of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's good for banks to talk about it, and companies making cars to talk about big data and innovation. But the reality is that the vast majority of people in this region live in somewhere between the first industrial revolution and somewhere between the first and the second industrial revolution. So I can take you to, 1 hour away from where we're sitting now here in the center of KL, to places that are very reminiscent of the second industrial revolution at best. So we have many parts of the region, if you go further away, which are essentially first industrial revolution or even pre-industrial revolution on an industrial scale. So let's be very, very careful about overhyping buzzwords and terminologies and not dealing with the basics. For instance, let's just even take a city like Kuala Lumpur, which at the superficial level looks extremely modern. But most schools in KL don't have proper sanitation facilities. Then I can expand that to households. Then you go beyond Kuala Lumpur and you go 100 miles away, and then you go 200, and then you go into the islands of Indonesia. We don't have the most basics of technological intervention. So when I think of entrepreneurship, which is again another thing that is spoken about so loosely, the idea that everyone can be an entrepreneur is a lie. There's no harm in not being an entrepreneur, just being a hard-working mason or a plumber. When we talk about that, we forget that technology should not be distilled to something to do with digitization only. So the most important technology, I would argue, we probably need in this part of the world would start with the toilet. Sanitation facilities that essentially provide dignity and remove people from the drudgery of living in conditions that are both unsanitary, undignified, and create a huge host of other problems. Technology will include providing proper water supply systems and wastewater treatment, which essentially create that sort of dignity. Technology that provides basic homes that essentially can bear what is going to happen in this region, which is the changing climate. So that's kind of where the mainstream discussion needs to be challenged. One is not saying we don't need all of those other things, but it's an oversimplification to live in urban areas and live in ghettos of elites who go to the business schools, etc., and then take this argument and try and spread it and then distort and create expectations that cannot be fulfilled. And I think, we can talk later about the role of education in this country, and the false premise that everyone can be an entrepreneur, an IT geek, or a doctor, or a lawyer. Who's going to grow the food? Who's going to fix the buildings? Who's going to maintain other things? Who's going to write some books?
Yeah.
Those are just as important things that we should have the next generation thinking about.
Great. And so these are ideas that go against the status quo. They go against, like you say, ideas from the business school. So how do you go about spreading your influence and your ideas about these topics?
By speaking about it on podcasts like this.
Correct answer, everyone.
By writing about it and being, in a way, and I don't want to put myself on a pedestal, but to be bold enough to challenge it. And so my intention in doing this is to not to be famous. It's to essentially get hopefully as we do more of this 1,000 young people who will have the battery switched on when they hear this and say, that makes sense, and then start to create their own narrative. The point of something like this is to essentially trigger a thought process, because the dumbing down is relentless. The mainstream discussion. And there's essentially a struggle for ideas. And I am convinced, because out of experience, that when the younger generation listen to this non-mainstream idea, they will understand the validity of what I'm saying. Why? Because I've done this many times. I've been to large audiences and schools and students in Indonesia, in China, in India, in Hong Kong. And when someone like me speaks, and I hope there'll be many others, they get excited, because it's not the same dumbed down conversation of business school professors, etc. And they all turn up because they have been seduced into believing that they'll receive some pearl of wisdom, and they'll become the next Jack Ma or something like this. And of course, these things don't happen this way. But even worse is not allowing others to think about solving some of the more basic problems through ideas and endeavor that are probably more purposeful. And that is important. And so I've spoken on many of these issues, and I've actually been surprised, but also encouraged by the reaction. What I want to do is speak more about this to a large young audience, but I can be traveling to cities everywhere and having 1,000 people. I joke sometimes when professors ask me to come and speak, and I say if it's 500 people, I turn up. 499, I'm not there. Meaning, get me a large group. Not because I think I'm important, but one needs to influence.
Yeah.
And part of the problem in many of the academic institutions, etc., is students are so busy running around, not studying, but passing exams. So they don't have time. And they're not interested in conversations that lead them down alternative avenues of thinking, etc. And so I'm hoping through this that just maybe we might reach 500,000 young people and others over the next year.
Fantastic. Well, we can hope that we can actually reach the audience that you want with this podcast, Chandran. But moving on into the separate second question now about sustainability. Now, you've been a champion of sustainability for over 20 years. So what does sustainability actually mean to you?
Well, let me start by talking about what most people confuse sustainability with. Most people think of environmental protection as sustainability. So my new book called The Sustainable State, I refer to what sustainability is and what environmental protection is. So let's take, for example, one of the biggest industries in this part of the region, and let's take the palm oil industry, for instance. So there's a lot of words about sustainability, environmental protection, etc. There is an area of overlap between sustainability and environmental protection. But if you take the palm oil industry, one of the most there are three dimensions of the palm oil industry that raises concerns. And let me say at the outset, I'm not against the palm oil industry. The question is, what does a responsible palm oil industry look like? There's one view that there's no such thing as a responsible palm oil industry because it's rapacious by design. But let's leave that aside and just look at what the palm oil industry is. There's three areas typically. One is essentially the creation of the palm oil industry and its expansion results in the destruction of rainforests and therefore biodiversity and all of this. That is a sustainability issue.
Yeah, we've all heard about Fonterra and the orangutans, right?
Yeah, so that is a sustainability issue. And when it comes to that element of sustainability, you can't ask palm oil companies to be sustainable in terms of rainforest destruction. You can only hope and expect and demand the state to essentially say, you cannot expand beyond these borders, etc. And then, in that way, push the palm oil industry to be more productive, given that growth is the mantra for all industries. But growth cannot be achieved through more rainforest destruction, okay? That sustainability cannot be put in the hands of palm oil companies. They don't do that. It's like asking Pizza Hut to sell less pizzas. Pizza Hut will not sell less pizzas. That is not their job, nor is it McDonald's job to sell less McDonald's. But you can price the externalities of consuming junk food that Pizza Hut and McDonald's will have to do certain things to do that. So that intrusion in the rainforest is one of the key kind of issues in palm oil. That's a sustainability issue. Then there's the other issue of the palm oil industry, which is the conversion of palm oil into the various, into its core material, which is done at the mills, etc. And with that, we have emissions, and we are both air and water. That's a pollution control issue. But of course, if you expand the palm oil industry more, you'll get more pollution. So there's a link to sustainability, but at site, it is essentially controlling emissions. That's an environmental protection issue. There too, one hopes that good palm oil companies would meet the laws and standards that have been set in Malaysia. It's pretty good high laws and standards. Then enforcement is a problem. It's an open secret that enforcement is weak. And therefore, apart from perhaps the big invest, and I hope that's true, the laws are broken every day of the week. This is go to any rural area and you will see. So that's the environmental side of it. And then the third element of it, and in fact there's a fourth element which I could cover too. The third element of it is the labor issues in relation to essentially an industry that is very dependent on cheap labor. So in Malaysia, much of that labor is imported. Does the industry essentially meet the basic rights? And I don't even want to talk about the UN human rights standards for corporations, etc. But do they meet the basic human rights? Anyone who is a keen observer would say there is mass infringement of those basic rights. The conditions in which people live, the rights there, the health and safety regulations that they have, they work under, and of course then wages, etc. So that's the third element. And then linked to the other element is of course the and actually it's important. I shouldn't dismiss it as a fringe issue. It's essentially the permeation of palm oil into essentially almost everything, a lot of things that we consume. I think there's one crude statistic that says that 50% of everything in a supermarket has some kind of palm oil, which has a social cost. It's actually a social cost. So then who regulates what sort of products can have how much palm oil, etc.? That is not the job of palm oil companies who claim to be sustainable. That is not their job. They wouldn't do that. Palm oil companies that claim to be sustainable would, ideally, meet all the environmental regulations and all the labor conditions, pay their taxes, etc. It is yet to be clear, the transparency, how much they do it, but let's hope that they do it. The sustainability one is the rainforest protection, etc. Some of the companies claim that they are doing it, and I don't think that should be a badge of honor. That's essentially an obligation to society that they have, and the rules and the laws of engagement. And then, of course, in terms of how the product, the palm, permeates and gets into all the different products that we have, there are major health issues. It is no secret that obesity levels in Malaysia are directly linked to overconsumption of basically oil-based foods, of which palm oil is a major contributor. So that's the difference between sustainability and environment.
Right.
And in this part of the world, we have an obligation now to figure out, as the population increases, how do we essentially navigate the next 30, 40 years? Well, on one hand, we want prosperity. On the other hand, we have a need, plus an obligation, to essentially protect the resource base, both current and future generations. My argument is, and I think this is again the non-mainstream. The mainstream discussion that young people going to universities, etc., learn is there's a bit of pollution control. You all must do this, but essentially you must continue to seek growth at any cost. And then the worst part of this education is the business education, which essentially does not address the issue of how do we grow, at what price, and what is the price of consumption, right? So what is the true price of the burger if you price in the palm oil and the externalities, which is an economic term that I'm happy to expand on? Our education systems do not ever prepare, and this is not just in Asia, throughout the world, but the education systems do not prepare the young generation to understand the complexities of the interrelationship between how goods and services are provided and the starting point, which is how do we use materials to provide those goods and services. So throughout the supply chain, there are costs. And education systems need to essentially educate the young people to understand where those costs are, how they are felt in society, where are the benefits, because there are benefits, where the externalities needs to be managed, what are the implications. And then there is, of course, an ethical dimension to how do you essentially grow in a sustainable manner, both from an environmental point of view, but also the obligations of society?
Yeah, sure. So if I can paraphrase you there, sustainability isn't just about the environment. You've touched on politics, you've touched on sustainable consumption and the economic space, and you've even touched on human rights and labor use. So from what you've also said about education, sustainability isn't even being taught in the right way.
No.
And it's often seen as a business buzzword, right? In corporations, it's
and
CSR.
the academic institutions who teach sustainability, including some of the leading ones like Cambridge, etc. I mean, it's all catering to a business objective. Business is not bad, but as I say in my book, businesses don't do sustainability, as I gave with the palm oil example. Businesses do environmental protection, and they do environmental protection typically under duress, the duress of regulation. They comply. In our part of the world, many of the businesses don't even comply with the laws. So even when it comes to environmental protection, we have so much, a vast majority of companies that don't comply. Then there is sustainability, which is the next hurdle, which is essentially rules created by the state, right? But teaching in the academic institutions in the world is very poor on this. You can go to the Stanfords, the Cambridges, they're all still about business and sustainability, which is an oxymoron. That doesn't mean businesses are bad, but the heart of sustainability is the notion of less. Businesses don't do less, they do more.
Great. Thank you very much, Chanjan. That's all we have time today. So, if you're interested in the future of sustainability, check out our content on the GIFT website. That's www.global-inst.com.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
We don't need